Hi everyone, welcome to the February 23rd edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski, and this week we're looking ahead to Saturday at Oaklawn Park, where there is a much anticipated Derby prep taking place. That is the Grade 2 Rebel Stakes, offering 50 Kentucky Derby qualifying points to the winner. And Craig, just given the lackluster nature of some of the Derby preps that we've seen recently, particularly in Florida, the Sam F. Davis, the Holy Bull, and even to some extent at Fairgrounds recently, I know the Risen Star just didn't live up to expectations of some people. I think a lot of hopes are now being placed on this Rebel Stakes because it's a large field of 11 horses, and it does feel like there is quite a bit of quality and potential signed on in this field.
Well, we do have plenty quality here, and in addition to being a grade two, let's not forget this is a $1 million race, so that's always going to help draw some quality as well. In addition to the 50 Derby points, and yeah, those other races you mentioned, I forget exactly what the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Timeform US Speed figure was, but I don't think any of these preps have topped it yet. And usually you would expect to see that as we are getting close to moving into March. You would like to see these horses progressing. I will say it's a trend to kind of get the better horses started a little later than in years past, and it seems to be getting later and later as we move on. But I do suspect we're finally going to get a fast race out of this one. Maybe I'll be disappointed, but I don't think so.
Yeah, I've been doing that Derby Watch with Brad Free, which you can see on DRF.com and the videos we've been doing on YouTube. And I'm not somebody who likes to develop Kentucky Derby opinions too early, as I know you aren't either, Craig, but that task kind of forces me to keep this running early morning line of the Kentucky Derby contenders. And when we started it 4 weeks ago, I set Arabian Night and Forte as the two favorites, not unexpectedly. And I really haven't had to move it at all in the past 3 or 4 weeks, just because we just haven't seen too many breakout performances. Maybe that's going to change on Saturday with this Rebel Stakes. We're going to talk about that race a little bit later, but we're going to discuss it in the context of this late pick 5 sequence at Oaklawn. We're talking about races 8 through 12 on this Saturday card. Obviously all dirt races, with that being the case at Oaklawn Park, but we've got a nice mix of allowance, maiden, and stakes events. The other stakes in this sequence is the Grade 3 Honeybee, that being a prep race for the Kentucky Oaks. We do close things out with an Arkansas bred maiden race, which I know Craig always loves, but we begin things, Craig, with 2 divisions of an optional claiming race, both at 6 furlongs for the older horses. I guess this race got so many entries, they split it into 2, and both halves of this split division optional claiming race, they've got some nice horses signed on. That kicks off with race 8, where we've got a few horses that are coming out of some allowance races that achieved some pretty high speed figures.
Yeah, I know we've talked about it in the past where it seems like these conditioned allowance races, these non-winners of two, we had sometimes non-winners of three, have kind of had a rebirth. I don't know if it's the purses for these races have gotten really big at a lot of tracks, but it used to be not all that long ago, it was tough to fill a non-winners of two, and now we basically had 19 horses entered for this split division, and there's some real quality in here. I mean, there's horses running figures that would be competitive in some stakes races.
Yeah, for sure. This is a $50,000 optional claiming, non-winners of 2 other than the condition for both of these races that we're going to kick off this pick 5 sequence with. And Craig, I want to start the discussion in race 8. Well, I should say, before we get to the contenders, we should just mention, as a general comment, there is some rain predicted in the forecast for Saturday at Oaklawn Park. I was just checking it once again. There's a slight chance of rain on Friday, a little bit greater chance on Saturday. It doesn't seem like it's definitely going to be some sort of downpour, but there definitely is a likelihood that there's going to be some precipitation. So just keep that in the back of your mind as you handicap this sequence, and then you can adjust when you see how the track is playing on race day. But let's dive into some of the contenders in this 8th race that kicks off the pick 5 sequence. And as I was just saying, I want to start the discussion with the horse that was pegged as the morning line favorite, the number 1 Flapjack. I'm not sure that this horse actually will go favorite in this race. I'm kind of interested to see how they ultimately bet this, but this is definitely a horse that you have to take seriously because he's going out for the Chris Hartman barn, and even when his horses might not look that appealing on paper, they seem to run well. So Flapjack, definitely a dangerous horse, but he is stepping up in class here.
Yeah, it's a pretty big step up, and I didn't particularly like that last race that even though he won, he was 4 to 5. It was just a starter allowance race. The horses that ran in behind him haven't done a whole lot of running. The figure declined. Don't like the inside draw in a race of this quality. So this is one where, like you said, I don't know if he'll be the favorite or not, but I'm not starting my pick five with him in it. I'm just not a fan of this particular horse.
Well, I wanted to preface him with that comment about the weather because he is a horse that has achieved all three of his dirt victories on wet tracks, and he's actually won over muddy sealed tracks twice in a row by pretty decisive margins. And he's actually 0 for 10 with just two third place finishes on fast track. So he does seem to be a little bit of a mud lover. Usually don't put too much stock in track condition, but it might be relevant for this particular horse, especially if that rain doesn't come. Let's look towards the outside, Craig, because the horse that I think might go favorite in here, that I believe is the horse to beat, is the number 6 Spankster. And this runner for Dwayne Lucas just keeps getting better. He's now a newly turned 4-year-old. Didn't really want the 2-turn mile in the 16th two back, but they turned him back to the 6 furlongs last time, and he put in a very strong effort against a couple of horses that probably would be favored if they were running in this race, Cogburn and Life is Hard.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Life is Hard, I think, in the next race. But yeah, they come out of that fast Cogburn race. I know it's one we talked about on the pace cast. Spankster is definitely a horse that I want to use. Um, I don't know if I'd say he's the horse to beat because you only have to look 3 lines down and see he wasn't able to beat another horse in this field, a Bizu. He did have a tougher trip that day. Abizu has had a better outside draw, a good pace setup that day. He didn't have an outside draw, but he had a great pace setup that day for his closing running style. And I do think this one's kind of going to come down to pace for a 6 furlong sprint. It doesn't look like there's a ton of speed drawn in here, but we do have a couple that are shown up near the front. Flapjack, who has tried to make the lead and has made the lead in his last three, albeit all with moderate to slow paces. And the 5 horse, one that's going to be a bit of a price in Improbable Journey, who's another quick win. So there is some speed. I just don't know if we're going to have a meltdown in here. So I think that would kind of swing the tables a little bit in the favor of the horse. You think is the horse to beat Spankster, but I don't want to write off some others in here, particularly Albizu.
Yeah, that horse, Albizu, that victory two back actually came for a very similar condition, nominators of two other then, but obviously he didn't run through the condition that day because he was in for the $62,500 tag. That's why he can run without the claiming tag attached in the same condition. Again, here, he actually beat a horse that has gone on a tear since then, edge to edge in that race two back. Edge to edge faded to third, but it's a race when, if you go back and watch it, edge to edge ran the best race. He did all the heavy lifting on the front end, and the race kind of fell apart into Albizu's lap at the end. So I don't want to judge him only on that effort. His surrounding performances, I'm not sure that they quite say to me he's good enough to win this race. So he's definitely a horse that I think is a contender here, but I personally would want more than that 3-1 morning line on him. And I'll just briefly circle back to the pace since you brought it up. Yeah, I agree. There's not a ton of pace in here, and I guess that does make the number 1 Flapjack a little bit more dangerous, though he could be under the gun from that rail post position. He's a funny horse. I mean, he had never shown that much speed early in his career, but his last couple of starts, he's just been this one-dimensional front runner who's able to get away from his fields in the early stages. Maybe those have been some less competitive paces, particularly last time. And the presence of the horse that you mentioned, Craig, the number 5, Improbable Journey, could be a real difficult factor for him because Improbable Journey is a horse that can get pretty aggressive in the early stages of his races. Just go back and watch his last race. When he didn't break on top, he actually broke a step slowly, and Cogburn was able to make the lead, and his rider, Gabriel Saez, just basically couldn't restrain him, and this horse ran up on the inside of Cogburn and actually stuck his head in front around the far turn, and Cogburn is a really fast horse who let him do it, but then came back and beat him. Improbable Journey, I know he's been getting beaten at this level the last couple of times, but he's been running speed figures on the TimeformUS scale that are right in line with a horse like Spankster, and I think he makes a lot of sense here, especially given the fact that he's drawn outside of that main pace rival. That could allow him to work out a better trip.
He's actually the horse that's going to be my top pick in here, Improbable Journey, and it's for the reason you said. I think he's going to get clear on the front end. I don't think Flapjack is as fast as him. Those blue fractions really dissuade me away from him from his last couple. And I just think in Probable Journey, when he gets clear, that's when he does his best running. And I could see it happening here. He might get overlooked. And as you say, his last three speed figures are as good as anyone in this race. I guess the only other horse I really wanted to mention was Mucho. He is a horse who has definitely run races in the past that would make him a contender here. It just seems like his form has totally went south, has nothing left. He's not for me, but I was wondering if you saw anything from him that would make you think he could turn things around.
No, not really. I mean, there was a time when he would have been pretty formidable against a field like this, but as you said, his form has just really gone in the wrong direction recently, and it kind of follows the same trend lines as his trainer, John Ortiz, who was having a lot of success at this time last year, and I don't know what's happened, but it's like he's operating as a completely different trainer these days. I mean, he's gone from a 20% trainer to a 10% trainer, and it's a trend that's been persisting for months now, so I don't know what's going on there, but Mucho has kind of lost whatever magic he had going last year. We'll move on from this race in just a second, Craig. There's one more horse that I do want to mention that I didn't know what to do with, and it's a horse that I'm a little bit familiar with, so maybe I'm overestimating his chances just because I'm a little bit too close to him. But the number 3, Senor Jobim, is coming out of a race at Aqueduct, and I just want to point it out because he broke very slowly that day, and basically was robbed of any chance he might have had because he broke slowly in a race that didn't feature any pace at all. They were just walking on the front end, and he had to actually do some running to get up into contention on the backstretch, and he never really made any headway, but that was just a total merry-go-round race. My problem is that was just a $25,000 claimer. It's weird to see David Jacobson now shipping him to Oaklawn to run in this ambitious spot. Jacobson can make moves that seem inexplicable or random at times, but this is a horse that's going to be a big price that does have some back races that at least put him on the fringes of being a player here. So I'm not saying he's my top pick by any means. He's just a price horse in this race that I find somewhat interesting.
Yeah, I could see that. I always wonder when the pace is that slow how much a bad break really hurts the horses because it doesn't seem like it would take much work to catch back up. Honestly, I haven't watched it though, so I would have to go see. Maybe the visual will give me a different impression. David Jacobs said he's been shipping some horses into Oaklawn. I think he even won one recently, so I guess he's branching out a little bit. So yeah, no problem with him.
Let's move on to the next leg of this pick 5 sequence. As I said, same conditions, the other division of this optional claiming 50,000, non-winners of 2 other than. And Craig, you could argue that this is the slightly stronger division since we do have a horse in Life is Hard who's coming off a very good effort at this level. Last time out, he is the number 9 in this race, was in a photo finish with Cogburn, who looks like a Steve Asmussen runner that could be bound for stakes races. And this race also features a horse that we talked about on the TimeformUS Pacecast as well, Osborne, who was actually moving up in class after he won a non-winners of 2 lifetime race last time out in January, but that horse certainly took a big step forward in his 4-year-old debut. So in those two, I think we've got a couple of runners in this field that look like they're going to be pretty tough to beat.
I would agree they're the two horses to beat. Personally, I prefer one much more than the other, and the one I prefer is Osborne. I really liked what I saw. I'm not sure where that race came from, but it was a huge step up for him. He was a horse who had always showed some talent, but didn't seem to be able to put things together. And that 117 speed figure just jumps off the page as much the best. My one knock against Life is Hard, and the reason I prefer Osborne much more is said it before on this show. I'm not a big proponent of the bounce theory, but for me, this is the one situation where this horse has bounce written all over him. He was laid off for about 8 months, came back, run a career best TimeformUS speed figure, did it in a tough race. He was fighting all the way to the wire with Cogburn, a very good horse, and it just feels like to me he's set up to take a step backwards.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern with a horse like that runs such a big race off a layoff if he can back it up. But I will say about Life is Hard, I mean, he was a 4-year old last year, so maybe he doesn't have the upside of a horse like Osborne, who just showed that improvement as a newly turned 4-year old. Life is Hard is now a newly turned 5-year-old. But, I mean, he had shown real ability last year. It's not like that recent 120 TimeformUS speed figure came out of nowhere. I mean, he was running some numbers in the low 1 teens last year as a 4-year-old at the very beginning of his career. So you could argue that that step forward last time was just natural progression for a horse that is now at the peak of his career. So Life is Hard, I think, is a legitimate player in this race. And the one other note I'll make about him is just the way that the allowance weights shake out here. He's getting a real swing in his favor. I mean, he is getting 6 pounds from his two main rivals in this race, Osborne as well as Golden Hornet, who are both carrying 124 to his 118. So just something to consider if you do take weight into consideration. I think when it's a swing like that of 6 pounds with horses that look pretty evenly matched on paper, it's something that's at least worth mentioning. And also, Life is Hard is drawn on the outside, and I think that's a perfect post position for a horse like him, who isn't a need the lead type by any means, but definitely wants to be forwardly placed and stalking, and he can be in that good pressing position from his outside post position. So for me, I'm viewing Life is Hard as the horse to beat in this race. I guess my question with Osborne is, can he prove that last race wasn't a fluke against legitimate competition? Because when you go back and look through that field, there's really no comparison to what Life is Hard was facing in that Cogburn race to what Osborne was facing when he beat a decent horse in Skelly by 7 lengths. But I mean, the horses that were behind him, I mean, they're not nearly of this quality. So he was supposed to win that race by a large margin. He did, but now he has to prove that he can do it against tough competition. And if he does, this could be the kind of horse for Ramo Quep that's eventually bound towards stakes races, but he's got to get through this hurdle first. You know, Craig, we talked about pace in the prior race. I do want to ask your opinion of the number 2 Golden Hornet, because he does seem like the pretty clear early leader here, especially drawing inside. They kind of have to go from the inside post position. Maybe he's a little bit light on speed figures, but this is a horse that still has some upside also as a newly turned 4-year-old.
Yeah, I think he's a little dangerous in this spot for just the reason you mentioned. I think he's probably going to be clear on the front end, just as the pace projector shows. We have the 8 horse Vulcan listed second. He has speed. Not sure he's quite as quick as Golden Hornet, so I do give him a bit of an outside shot in here. Not a big fan of the 4-to-1 morning line though. We Obviously, we won't know when we play the pick five what the odds would be. But if I was playing the race vertically and I was going to use him, I would want much more than that, at least 6 to 8 to 1 range, I would say. Because 4-to-1, it just seems like with his speed figures, he would have to improve quite a bit.
I probably give him a slightly higher chance than you do, Craig. This horse, I mean, he actually has faced some good horses. I mean, that he ran in that $250,000 stakes race at Mahoning Valley 3 back and wasn't disgraced against horses like Tejano Twist and Knocker Down. And actually, he came back and beat Knocker Down in his last start. Now, maybe it's not the same Knocker Down that we saw in that stakes race, because that horse has subsequently been purchased by different connections and is now with Brad Cox, which you would think is an upgrade, but it seems like Knocker Down has lost his form a little bit. But still, Golden Hornet was really game to beat that horse 2 back, because they dueled a long way out and he put that one away. And I also thought he showed a lot of grit 2 back when he was kind of on the inside in a race that was dominated by outside movers, and he just never quit and battled back for second. This horse has a lot of fight in him, and I think that could serve him well in a race like this. So he's definitely one that I want to include on my tickets. I probably lean towards making him more of a B and Life is Hard an A, but it's a race where I generally do want to go 3 deep.
There was a couple others I just wanted to mention real quick. One is the 6 Wayland Springs. He definitely had some races that were competitive last year. He won a stakes at Oaklawn, the Bachelor Stakes, with a good speed figure. Seems to have lost that form. I just thought it was interesting. He picks up Irad Ortiz, who's, I would say, the top rider in the country, probably a little doubt, but this horse is just way off form. He's not a horse I want to use, but I didn't want to totally overlook him. The one horse I have some real question marks about, and I might use a little bit in here, is a horse who he's been around, it seems like forever, even though he's only 6 years old. He's running some big races, and that's the 10-4 left. Hasn't been in great form lately, but the one thing that caught my eye and makes me maybe want to go 4 deep in here is that last race, he was claimed by Chris Hartman, who we've already talked about, and immediately improved quite a bit. It was in a cheaper race, but the 113 speed figure he ran that day doesn't put him too far off the top horses in here. I like the outside draw, so he's one. Depending on how I structure my ticket, I might try to get him on there.
Craig, I got to backtrack a little bit. I think I misspoke. I'm glad you brought that horse up because when I was talking about this race, I kind of forgot about him for a second. And I do want to talk about Four Left. I agree. He's a horse that I think you have to use in this race. I don't know if he's going to be that 10-1, just given the strength of the stable. But this is a horse that, while he hasn't run the gigantic speed figures that some others in here have, he's got the back class, and he did show improvement off the claim for Chris Hartman last time. Was beaten by a decent horse in Full Authority and got a good trip. I mean, no major excuses, but I was looking up stats for Chris Hartman. The thing that I want to point out is second off the claim over the past 5 years. Listen to these stats. Chris Hartman is 50 for 155. That's a 32% win rate with an ROI of $3.20. That's insane for a 5-year stat for a trainer like Chris Hartman who gets bet to have a ROI above $3 in a 150 horse sample. And just to point out, that stat also applies to Flapjack in the prior race, so they're both second off the claim. The difference is Flapjack's going to be a short price, and I think Four Left is going to be a generous price in this race. So yeah, I think I forgot he was in this race for a second when I was talking before, but he's a horse I definitely am using prominently on my tickets in this pick 5 sequence.
Well, I'm glad I brought him up then.
Yes, thank you.
And that stat, I knew the stat would be good, but that's pretty mind blowing. I never thought it would have been that good.
Let's move on to the stakes portion of this pick 5 sequence. Race 10 is the grade 3 Honeybee, going a mile and a 16th for the 3-year-old fillies. We've got a large field of 12 signed on here, Craig, and I think that the morning line maker got it right with regard to the two favorites. I think Grand Love and Wet Paint likely to take a lot of the support in this race. There is a horse that I think was a big miss on the morning line, but maybe we'll get to that in just a little bit. But let's talk about these favorites first, Craig. I mean, what are we supposed to do with Grand Love, who was highly thought of as a 2-year-old, obviously won her debut impressively for Steve Asmussen at Saratoga last year, earning the best speed figure of her career and one of the best speed figures of anybody in this race. And they've stretched her out in 2 subsequent starts, and she's kind of failed to finish off those races. Obviously, one was the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies, though we can question how strong that Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies really was based on some horses that we've seen run back out of it. How are you viewing this filly? Does she really want to go this far? And is this just going to be too tough a pace situation for her?
I'm viewing it that she doesn't want to go this far because that's where all the evidence points. I mean, it's not like in her route races she's had tough trips. She gets to the lead. She's not setting crazy fast paces. The Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies has the first couple fractions in red, but that's mostly because it was a slow race. I mean, if they were better horses and ran a better speed figure, that wouldn't have happened. So for me, at 3-1 on the morning line, and I suspect she'll get bet even heavier than that. I prefer others in here, and I'm not going to use her.
How about that other potential favorite, or the one that could vie for favoritism, the number 7, Wet Paint? This seems like a different kind of horse than Grand Love. Grand Love was so precocious on debut and has kind of gone backwards a little bit since then, whereas Wet Paint is very much a progressive sort. I mean, she didn't look like very much when she broke her maiden at Horseshoe Indianapolis 3 starts back, but she's just gotten better start after start, and she showed that she could transfer that form at least to a wet dirt surface last time out in the Martha Washington. Yeah, we agree about that. I think she is The horse to beat in this race for sure, the most likely winner, however you want to phrase it. I mean, she's an A for me in this pick 5 sequence, and I agree with everything you said. And she just feels like the kind of horse where the light bulb is turning on. It's not quite, at full blast yet, but it's definitely getting there because there clearly is some talent, and she's like a big frame of a horse who seems like she's still a little bit goofy figuring things out. She didn't break that well last time. That's just her. But she's definitely getting more in the bridle. We saw her make that move a little bit earlier in her race 2 back, and then last time out she came with that big late run to finish off the race even stronger, and she's just got this massive stride on her, so definitely feels like there's still forward to go for Wet Paint, who I always think is a great name for a horse that is still figuring things out. The horse, Craig, that I think is going to attract support in here that I guess was just sort of missed on the morning line is the number 1, Effortlessly Elegant, who I wouldn't say that I don't love her in here. I think she's a contender, but I'm not expecting to get to the 20-1 on her. And I want to point that out to the listeners who might gravitate towards this horse for the morning line. I think she's going to be 5 or 6-1 in this race. That's the point that I want to make. And this is a horse that has shown some talent. She had a nightmare trip in her debut at Churchill Downs, and that's one of the reasons why she was bet down to 3-5 last time at Oaklawn Park. And she was an easy winner of that 6-furlong race. But I mean, there are just so many things pointing to this horse. She's by Liam's map. She's bred to go longer. She's going out for the Norm Cassie barn, who is just a crazy 10 for 19 at this Oaklawn Park meet. So, I mean, going out for a strong barn. I mean, I think there are a lot of people that are going to be landing on this horse, and it's going to drive the price down considerably.
Yeah, I agree. There's no chance she's going to be 20-1. I'm not sure what to do with her as a better though. If she was 20-1, it would be a no-brainer, but that's not going to happen, as you said. I would be shocked if she's even 8-1 in this field based on that last race. I mean, the word was out. Everybody knew about the trip. She just looked so good that day. There's no way she's slipping off at a high price. My concern here is Grand Love, who we already talked about. She did win that race wire to wire. Maybe Effortlessly Elegant doesn't have to go to the front end, but drawing the rail is going to make it kind of difficult if she doesn't. So I'm a little torn on whether to use her or not in here. And there's also some speed right to her outside, and I think that's some quality speed as well. In addition to Grand Love is the 2-horse Towhead, who ran a huge speed figure last time right up on the lead. She's been a horse who has led in prior races. So we have this coded as a race with a fast pace. I think that it is actually going to develop with those 3 inside horses, and I think it even sets up more for Wet Paint.
Yeah, Craig, I want to talk a bit about Towhead, the number 2, because I've sort of been in this evolution in my handicapping about how I'm viewing the Lasix issue. Lasix on, Lasix off. It's something that we have to confront quite a bit in stakes races these days, and any horse that's racing on the Kentucky Derby or Oaks Trail has to come off Lasix to receive points in these races. And a horse like Towhead, it really makes you wonder a little bit because she looked pretty ordinary for the first 8 starts of her career, and then all of a sudden she jumps up with this 107 TimeformUS speed figure last time, and you're not the only one that has that as a very fast race, and that was first time Lasix. Now she has to come off Lasix, and I was looking up some stats about this. It really is trainer specific as to who does well, who does poorly coming on and off Lasix. Mike Maker is not somebody that has particularly strong stats, so I do wonder a little bit about whether we can expect her to repeat that same kind of race, or if she's just going to turn back into the horse that she was 2 and 3 back.
Yeah, it's a tough call. It's one of those things. It's always good to evolve as a handicapper, and I like that you're doing that because I do think Lasix matters. We've talked about that privately for a lot of reasons, and I like the trainer angle that you're adding. It's not a one size fits all thing. So I agree that was a fast race, but I'm not a fan of Towhead in here, partly because of the Lasix and partly just because of the fate situation.
Yeah, there is one more horse that I want to mention just because this is the kind of race where I feel like some horses might slip through the cracks a little bit, and I want to find somebody that I think might not be the most likely winner, but will just offer fair value in this race. And for me, that's the number 5, Condensation, who I think is listed at a realistic 12-1 on the morning line. This is a horse that I don't think is going to take too much support coming out of a a decent allowance victory last time out, but she just seemed to me like a horse that took a big step forward with the stretch out in distance. Probably shouldn't come as a big surprise given that she's bifrosted out of a Tisdale Dam. And she's not the biggest horse, but she just has, a nice stride to her, a really tidy action way of moving that says to me that, she's going to be getting better going these added distances. And that seems like it came out of nowhere a little bit, that improvement last time out, but she hadn't gotten the best trip in her prior race when she was just sort of in no man's land in this, outside of this pace duel going 5 wide around the far turn. And last time out, she got a much better trip, was able to make the front end, set some legitimate fractions, but held off a pretty good rival in Dear Lady, who was the odds-on favorite that day. Now, I don't think the condensation has any chance of making the lead here, but I also don't think that she's a horse that needs the lead. She was an effective closer in her sprint races a little bit early in her career, so I think that she could work out the right kind of stalking trip in this race, and she's going to be the rare Chris Hartman horse that isn't that short a price, so she's definitely one that I want to be using in this sequence. Let's move on to the featured race in this pick 5 sequence, the featured race on the Saturday card at Oaklawn Park, the Grade 2 Rebel Stakes. As Craig said, $1 million purse for this one. The 3-year-old's going a mile and a 16th. And Craig, the quality is drawn down towards the inside. The first 6 runners in the starting gate are what a lot of people are going to be following here. We've got 2 from the Brad Cox stable, 3 from the Steve Asmussen stable, the former Bob Baffert runner who's now going out for Tim Yakteen, and the number 6 Reincarnate. All of these horses could step forward and potentially be major players on the Kentucky Derby trail, but first they've got to pass this test. And I guess we should start the conversation with the Brad Cox horses because they are listed as the 2 shortest prices on the morning line. And, the number 1 Verifying is a horse that I know that you and I have been going back and forth about a little bit with regard to that last race of his, the allowance race at Oaklawn Park in January, when he won so impressively by over 5 lengths over a couple of next out winners, one of which Gun Pilot is in this race. And I know that was a difficult day to make speed figures. It seemed like the track had gotten faster slower, I should say, late in the day, and Verifying ran early in the day, a couple of 1-mile races, just achieved similar times. It didn't seem like it made a whole lot of sense on paper, but that Verifying race is definitely coming back to be stronger than it might have seemed at the time.
Yeah, the second and third place finishers both came back to win, albeit they didn't run particularly fast races. Gun Pilot, who's in here, and another horse, Two Eagles River. I mean, they ran fine. They ran low hundreds. I did wind up changing the speed figure. I think it went up 6 to 8 points. I forget what the exact number was. It was a crazy day. I'm still not super confident in it, but it gave Verifying a 110 for that race. I have to say, I still don't love them in here. I think there is a lot of speed in this race. Some of it from horses who are competitors, but there's a lot of long shots in here who I don't really consider contenders. As a matter of fact, we have 3 of them lined up on the front end that are quick. They may not be able to see out the mile in the 16th, but they've run fast in sprints. And I just worry that Verifying is going to get shuffled back from that inside post. And he also doesn't have any particular big edge in speed figures, even after the upgrade of that last race over some of his other rivals in here.
Yeah, we should say he is a horse that looks very strong on the Beyer speed figures. I know Beyer gave that last race a huge number, higher than the stakes that day, that higher than Ginobili got, winning, I think it was the Essex Stakes. Or I think the 5th season, rather. I mean, Verifying has to back up that kind of number, and if he does, I think he is the most likely winner of this race, but he still does have some questions to answer. I mean, it's not like he was the best 2-year-old last year. I mean, he was just a mediocre 6th in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, a dozen lengths behind Forte, and While there are no Fortes or even Cave Rocks in this race, Verifying, I think, still does have some things to prove, and he is yet another horse that ran that big race last time on Lasix, has to come off Lasix to run in this Rebel Stakes. That actually is also the case for Brad Cox's other runner, Giant Mischief, who did run on Lasix in the Springboard Mile last time. The thing, though, that I will point out about Brad Cox with regard to that Lasix switch is Brad Cox is one of the few trainers whose statistics just are, totally flat from Lasix on to Lasix off. I mean, strong numbers across the board, specifically in graded stakes, switching off Lasix. Brad Cox is 18 for 56 over the past 5 years, 32% with a $2.22 ROI. So maybe something we shouldn't be too concerned about for these two horses in particular. And I do think Verifying is a major player in this race. He is, of course, the younger half brother to Midnight Bisou, who was accomplished going longer. I know some people have some doubts about how far this progeny of Justify really want to go. We've seen some mixed signals from his horses getting longer distances so far, but it is very early in his freshman crop. So Verifying I would regard as a contender in this race. But Craig, it sounds like you want to go in some other directions.
Yeah, there's some others. I'll start with the lower priced horses in the field. Giant Mischief was a horse I saw run here at Remington. He comes in with the best TimeformUS speed figures along with Reincarnate. And I liked what I saw from him in the Springboard Mile. What I didn't like was that he totally blew the break and got away dead last. Kind of let the winner get away from him that day, Wild Atlantic Storm. But I have it as a pretty fast race, and I don't want to totally write him off. He was 4 to 5 that day. I thought he ran fine. He just needs to get out of the gate, so he's a horse I'll be using. Reincarnate, I'm a little torn on. He's the former Bob Baffert, now in the Tim Yakteen barn. He comes in with a good speed figure in one of those Bob Baffert intramural prep races out at Santa Anita the Sham, where he had the top three finishers. There was actually one other horse that looked strong on paper, but just something went amiss that day, wasn't ever a factor. He ran a 114, but I can't help but think back to last year where the horses who switched barns out of Bob Baffert didn't do all that particularly well. So I'm kind of lukewarm on him at best. A horse I do actually like quite a bit in here and is one who's going to be a price is the 3-horse Red Route 1. He's one of the Steve Asmussen horses. He ran second behind Bob Baffert's Arabian Night, who many people I assume have as their Derby favorite off that race. And he just seems like a horse who's really moving in the right direction to me. He had some tougher trips. He came out of that Kentucky Jockey Club race, which was just kind of a goofy race. I know we've talked about it. Um, no pace whatsoever, had a tough trip, but I thought he ran fine. So I wasn't all that surprised when he exploded to a career best TimeformUS speed figure 109 last time. And I think he's going to get plenty of pace to close into. And at 10 to 1 on the morning line, I think he's a dangerous horse.
I'll just make a few points about the horses that you mentioned first off. Giant Mischief, I agree. He was the best horse last time in that Springboard Mile. The Springboard Mile has just become a weird race, though, Craig. I feel like it's now 2 or 3 years in a row that you and other speed figure makers have given out big numbers to that race, and it just doesn't really get backed up. And it feels like that's starting to become the case this year. I mean, obviously, maybe something went a little bit wrong with Echo again in his next start, although the reports came back that he was fine after the Lecompton. He just didn't run his race at all. And I just starting to have some doubts about whether that number is legitimate. And we could also look back to Giant Mischief's race against Arabian Lion. What's happened to Arabian Lion since that race? He's been terrible in 2 subsequent starts. I think he's actually finished last in his next 2 races. They were going longer distances, and maybe he just doesn't want to go that far, but it is a reason enough for me to doubt the form a little bit. And furthermore, I don't think Giant Mischief is a Derby horse. Maybe he'll be okay going a mile and a 16th, but to me, this is a sprinter. He's out of a damn vertical oak who just really didn't want to go a step beyond 6 furlongs. He's got this quick action. To me, he looks like a sprinter, and I'll be surprised if he keeps getting better as the distances get longer. So I have some major reservations about him at what I think is going to be a shortish price. As for Reincarnate, I mean, I don't want to mislead people, Craig. This horse is trained by Bob Baffert right now. I mean, he worked under Bob Baffert's tack just a couple days ago. I mean, he's been prepared by Bob Baffert for this race, and it's not the kind of situation like we saw last year where the horses were trained by Tim Yakteen while Bob Baffert was under a suspension. Bob Baffert is training horses. He's at the racetrack. So I'm not saying that Tim Yakteen is a paper trainer. I'm just saying that maybe Bob Baffert has a little more influence over things this year than he did last year. And, you know, we'll see what happens a month down the line when these horses are listed under Tim Yakteen's name for a longer period of time. But, I mean, he's been prepared by Bob Baffert for this race. And I'm just curious to see how this California form stacks up elsewhere, because we've seen some of these races that are just dominated by Bob Baffert trainees get very high speed figures. It seems like there's real power out in California, but we haven't seen necessarily outside of Arabian Night those horses ship and have success. So I'm more than anything just interested to see how Reincarnate runs in this race. And, you know, Craig, you probably won't be surprised, since I've talked about this horse a little bit in the past. I'm also a big fan of Red Route 1 in this race, and also just in general. I think this is a horse that has real potential. He's by Gun Runner. He's out of a full sister to Untappable, or I should say he is out of a full sister to Untappable by Tapit, and he just seems like the kind of horse that has wanted longer distances really since the start of his career. I think that's why they started him out on turf, because he's just a horse that needs to run long, and he's just been slowly but surely improving. Personally, I thought he ran the best race of anybody in that Kentucky Jockey Club Stakes, because while Instant Coffee got that clear run on the outside, he was stymied in traffic and behind horses for much of the stretch drive. And I really liked the late run that he put in last time out in the Southwest. The pace was honest, but it's not like that was a race that fell apart. I mean, just look at Frosted Departure, who's also in here. He was a big price that day and stalked Arabian Night and still held on for third. So there wasn't a whole lot of running going on from the back of the pack. And the other horse that was closing in that race was Sun Thunder, who we just saw come back to finish second at a big price in the Risen Star last week. So I think Red Route 1 makes a lot of sense in this race, and I do feel like he will be a fair price.
Yeah, you make a good point about Bob Baffert. I'm glad you brought that up. He is actually still training these horses. I'm going to have to refresh, do some research on how it's going to work going forward. I don't know that he can just change names as they go into these preps for Kentucky Derby points. I think they have to stay in the barn, but it doesn't matter for this race. For this race, he's been doing the training, so that's an excellent point. I guess the only other horse I wanted to talk about, because I do think there's a lot of filler in here, is Gun Pilot. He was the horse who ran second to Verifying. He's another Steve Asmussen trained horse. He came back to win a nice allowance race. Didn't really run much of a speed figure, so he's not for me, but he's probably going to take some money in here.
Yeah, he's one that I think has potential. I'm not sure that he's quite ready for this challenge just yet. I know they've been rushing him along a little bit to get into this race. He's coming back just 3 weeks after that allowance victory. I think he's got some likable attributes, and I thought he showed a good turn of foot last time. Based on pedigree and just the way he moves, he's a horse that I might want to see on turf down the line. That's just something like a note that I made in the back of my head, but he's definitely one that I would be regarding as more of an underneath type as opposed to a win candidate in this race. And the one more horse that I'll mention, Craig, that I did kind of already bring up, but I'll just mention his name once again, is the number 11 Frosted Departure. I don't want to completely disregard this horse because he's going to be a big price, and he's got speed figures that certainly put him in the mix. I think he outran a lot of people's expectations when he held on for third in that Southwest last time out. And maybe Ken McPeak just got him wrong a little bit, concentrating on those sprint races, because he showed that he could go 2 turns last time, and it's a difficult post position, but I do think that's going to be built into his price. So I would use him as like a C type in this pick 5 sequence.
Yeah, I can see that. His speed figures are right there with some of the others. Not quite as high as Giant Mischief and Reincarnate, but with everyone else. I think he'll have to change his running style a little bit, but it shouldn't be a surprise. And we've seen some turnarounds from Ken McPeak lately with a horse like Dennington. I remember he kind of turned the tables. Looked like he had bad form like this one and got things going. So yeah, I'm never going to try to talk anybody off of a 20 to 1 shot. The horse certainly has some positive attributes.
Well, let's close things out with this Arkansas bred maiden special weight race going 6 furlongs for the 3-year-old and older runners. And I think that's an important point to make, that we do have the 3-year-olds running against older horses in this race. And personally, Craig, some people get caught up in the weight break and that kind of stuff. I like the 3-year-olds in this race just generally because they've often had fewer chances and have more upside than some of the older rivals that have been stuck at this condition for a long time. I look at a horse like the number 2 Skyped, who has some of the best speed figures in the race, but he's a 6-year-old and he's already had a lot of chances to break through at this level and hasn't gotten it done yet. So I'm looking more for horses that have a little bit of upside.
I totally agree with you. I feel the same when allowance races start and we get 3 and up after we go through the whole spring with mostly 4 and up. Usually the 3-year-olds have an advantage. They're still getting better. They're not proven losers, and I think that's the case here too. We have a big field. There's 14 entered, only 12 can go. The two also eligibles didn't do a whole lot for me. Maybe if they drew in, the 14 might be worth a look. Certainly not the 13. But I'm going to assume that they won't. And for me, it's just kind of a two-horse race. It's two of the 3-year-olds that you mentioned. The 7-horse Midnight Texas, who's the second choice on the morning line. I'd actually be surprised if this horse didn't wind up going favored. He's trained by Chris Hartman now, first time in his barn. Chris Hartman does great with horses first time in his barn. The horse has a big, huge speed figure edge, although those last two came on turf. He's shown that he can run a bit on dirt. The finish positions don't look great in those races, but he was in against two Bob Baffert horses that were breaking their maiden, National Treasure and Newgate. So I think he's fine, and this is just a humongous class drop. So I think he's going to be really tough to beat. If anyone can beat him, it's probably another 3-year-old, the 10 Time and Beyond. He just ran fine last time. He had a tough start in that race. He made a big run around the turn. He wasn't able to quite get to the favorite that day, but I think he ran the best race. I liked how he moved on the turn. And for me, it's just these two. It would be a stretch to make a case for anyone else.
Yeah, I agree about those two horses. They look pretty tough to get past in this race, and I'm also on the same page as you with regard to how the public is likely to bet this one. I do expect the number 7 Midnight Taxes to go favored here, and yeah, he just faced significantly better horses in those first two starts on dirt. At Del Mar, I mean, in addition to the winners, Newgate and National Treasure, one being a graded stakes winner, the other being third in the Grade 1 Breeders' Cup Juvenile. I mean, he also met Hard to Figure, who's now graded stakes placed, Practical Move, who's a graded stakes winner out of that race. So, I mean, those were some really good horses he was running against, so not a big surprise that he wasn't able to be competitive with those. And as you said, even the speed figures that he ran, getting beaten by double-digit margins, would make him formidable against this field. And it's just a logical move. It's not like he's dropping in for a tag. This is a maiden special weight race. He's just an Arkansas bred that for some reason was running in open company races out in California, and makes a lot of sense to take advantage of this condition. And he's going into a barn, Chris Harton, that just has a lot of success. So, I mean, there are a lot of arrows pointing in the direction of Midnight Taxes. And I'm maybe not quite as positive on the 10 Time and Beyond. He did have some trouble at the start last time. I didn't think it affected him that much. He made a decent run after that, just had dead aim with the leader, couldn't quite forge past that rival. So he seems legit, but I do prefer the number 7 Midnight Taxes. I'll throw one more horse into the mix, Craig, and that's the number 1 Shakeup, who just seems like a horse that really didn't have things figured out for the first few starts of his career, but he took a step forward, 2 back, and that was a race that featured a strong pace, so that helped his closing run, but he was absolutely gobbling up the ground at the end of that race and ran right past the leader soon after the wire, and he was a huge price that day, and then actually showed for the first time some improved tactical speed last time, and it muted his late run a little bit, but he was again staying on pretty well at the finish. So I feel like he's a horse for Sharp Barn and Brett Calhoun that just still has a little bit of upside. So he's one that I would use in here because there is a bit of speed in this race. I mean, there are a number of horses that want to be forwardly placed, and he does seem like one that could be picking them up late if things do come apart at all. So he's the third horse that I would use, but I wouldn't want to go more than 3 deep in this spot.
Yeah, I can see that. He's on the morning line, what, 3 times the price of Time and Beyond. So yeah, I've got no problem with that. It just depends how the ticket shakes out. I guess we're both in agreement that Skype is not for us.
No, I mean he fits. It'll probably finish on the board, but I mean I just don't like relying on horses like this as win candidates, and there are other things working against him. A jock who hasn't won at this meet, lower profile connection. So he's just not for me, especially if he's anywhere near that 9-2 morning line. Well, Craig, let's do a brief recap as we often do, and we'll go back through this sequence and just kind of highlight some of the horses that we'll be looking to use prominently, key on. So I'll let you go first.
Okay, the eighth, the first half of that allowance race. My top pick's actually going to be Improbable Journey. I think there's a good chance he might get loose in here. I'm not a fan of the Chris Hartman horse Flapjack, though. If it does rain, like substantially rain, and it's an off track, I would probably change and use him as well. I'm also going to use Spankster and Albizu. Um, uh, that's about it for me in that one. I don't want to go too deep. In the second half of that allowance race, I prefer Osborne to Life is Hard. I still think Life is Hard is a strong bounce candidate in that race. I liked what I saw from Osborne last time. I will use Golden Hornet, as you mentioned, more as a C type. And then the horse that I think might be at least a B and maybe an A is Four Left, especially after you told me those Chris Hartman second off the second off the claim stats. That's just huge. I expected improvement, but not to that level. I know it's a step up in class, but sometimes when trainers are going the way Chris Hartman is, class doesn't seem to matter very much. In the Honeybee, I'm totally against Grand Love in here. I really prefer Wet Paint quite a bit. I also mentioned Boss Lady Bailey. I think is a horse who could lose and get up the pieces and get the pick up the pieces if wet paint for whatever reason doesn't show up that day. And I also don't want to toss out effortlessly elegant, little tongue twister there. But I do not expect the 20-1 as you mentioned. In the Rebel, I'm very lukewarm on Verifying, not as high on him as you are. I really do like Red Route 1 in that race. I still use Giant Mischief and Reincarnate. So just three deep for me. And then in the last race, I'll use the three that we talked about. You convinced me on the one, but I'm going to lean pretty heavily on Midnight Taxes.
Well, Craig and I have a lot of overlap as we go through this sequence. In that first leg, I would mostly be leaning on Improbable Journey and Spankster. I just have trouble warming up to too many others in this race. Albizu, I guess, could win with the right trip, and I did mention Senor Jobim, but they'd be more B or C type horses if I was looking to make an ABC wager, and I would try to beat that Chris Hartman runner Flapjack, especially if he is a short price, and you will get to see the board in this first leg of the sequence. In the ninth race, I'm going to spread a little bit. I like Life is Hard. He's my top pick in this race, but I do want to use the 10-4 left to, Craig, I'm glad he brought up because he's a horse that definitely is worth of inclusion at that price. The 4 Osborne, I worry he could get a little overbet off that last victory because I do think he has some things to prove from a class standpoint, but I'll use him, and I'll also use the number 2 Golden Hornet, who I just don't want to leave out a horse that is as game as he is and likes to win races, so he'll be on my tickets as well. 4 deep in that race. In the Honeybee, I want to try to pare things down a little bit. It's a large field. I think you have to make some decisions. I do think Wet Paint is very much the horse to beat, but I also want to use the number 5 Condensation, who I laid out the case for a little bit earlier. I just think she's a horse that's moving in the right direction, has improved with added ground. So they're the main 2 uses for me in that Honeybee. I could have some backups, maybe a little bit of Grand Love, Effortlessly Elegant, perhaps the horse that Craig mentioned, but I do want most of my play going through the 5 and 7. I like Red Route 1 quite a bit in the Rebel, just a horse that I've been a fan of. I think he's finally landing in a spot where he's supposed to get the right kind of pace set up, and he could fly a little bit under the radar, so he's my top pick there. I would also use Verifying. I think he's legit, and the number 6 Reincarnate, another horse that will be on my tickets, but I don't want to go too much deeper than that. I'm somewhat against Giant Mischief, and if he does well in this race, he'll just have to beat me. Then we'll close things out with Craig and I pretty much agreeing. We'll use those same 3 horses, Shake Up, Midnight Taxes, and Time and Beyond. So, Craig, A few places where I think we can, zig where others are zagging, find some horses that might be going off at big prices. But it does seem like there are a few races in the sequence, particularly those first couple of races, the optional claimers, where there are some favorites that look strong. So I'd be careful about crafting a ticket that's too bloated.
Yeah, I'm never one that plays much of a bloated ticket. I play smaller tickets and hope to hit. I've hit a few over the years that has me in the positive side, but let's not kid anyone. These are hard. These to hit a pick five, especially on a card like this, all big fields, it's very difficult to do. So I want to give myself a chance while not spending a ton of money because it only takes one bad opinion and you're out. Um, it's just the nature of the pick five. So I'm never going to be a guy that puts in $300 or $400 in one of these races. I just hope I'm right on a particular sequence and look for the big score. And you got to get those, you have to play some horses that are going to offer some prices. And I think we gave out a few of those in here.
I think that's a good way to play. One of the ways to be successful in these pick five sequences is to not be too afraid to lose. Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Forecast this week. Craig and I will, of course, be back next week on the Pacecast to talk a little bit more about the Rebel and the Honeybee and the implications for the Kentucky Derby and Kentucky Oaks, along with all the other stakes action that took place this past weekend and any other notable performances that we see. So make sure to catch that. You can catch all of these TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. Make sure to catch that TimeformUS Pacecast coming up next Tuesday.